Title: She Took One Selfie Before Vanishing Forever True Crime Documentary. The selfie that stopped time. The photo was ordinary in every way. A quick bedroom selfie, a bright smile, the sort of image you send to close people to close out the day. Sydney Lof angled her phone, showed off a white blazer and a faint dimple, and sent the picture to her mother with a casual "good night." It was the kind of small ritual that had become a steady thread between them, a nightly check-in that meant everything, and on that November evening in 2017 would become the last ordinary thing anyone would ever have of her. Sydney grew up loud and free in a small Nebraska town. Bikes, ATVs, sledding, school plays, and team sports. Scoliosis had rerouted some of her athletic dreams, but it couldn't smother the rest of what she loved: theater, animals, puzzles, the tiny chaos of a life lived on the move. After high school, she moved 3 hours away to Lincoln for a job and a shot at independence. Coworkers called her kind. Friends described her as generous and funny. She had a kitten named Nimsy and a tattoo that read in small, hopeful script, "Everything will be wonderful." It was a phrase she clung to like a talisman during darker spells of anxiety and depression. Dating apps had become a part of Sydney's search for connection. When she matched with a profile calling itself Audrey, the chemistry felt easy. Late-night chats about music and jokes, a few photos shared, and then a first date that ended with a sweet message and a promise to see each other again. By November 15th, she felt comfortable enough to meet Audrey for a second time. She took that bedtime selfie before stepping out into the night, unaware she was starting a series of events that would fracture dozens of lives. When Sydney didn't return calls, missed a shift at work, and skipped the small rituals that anchored the coroner's report would later indicate signs of restraint and injuries consistent with a violent struggle. The blunt fact of strangulation closed the worst of the questions. For a family that once gauged their days by nightly texts and weekend dinners, the world narrowed to courtrooms and search grids. For a tight-knit community, the case ripped through familiar complacency about trust and safety. For investigators, the work was painstaking and forensic, matching timestamps to purchases, plotting cell tower pings, analyzing fibers and DNA, and interviewing witnesses who began to reveal a pattern of manipulation and recruitment surrounding Aubrey Trail. Chapter 1 ends not with answers, but with the shift from hope to resolve. The moment a missing person search turns into a homicide investigation. Sydney's smiling selfie, frozen in time, became more than a farewell. It became proof of the ordinary life that had been stolen. People who had loved her were left with rituals they could no longer perform, and a community that had to reckon with the ways technology can both connect and conceal. The next chapter would be about how the law rose to meet the horror, how witnesses found voice, and how two people accused of a monstrous plan came to stand, finally, in the light of accountability questions. For a family that once gauged their days by nightly texts and weekend dinners, the world narrowed to courtrooms and search grids. For a tight-knit community, the case ripped through familiar complacency about trust and safety. The courtroom and the reckoning. When the searchlights dimmed and the police files thickened, the story shifted from frantic searching to forensic patience. Evidence is patient. It waits, it accumulates, and then it speaks in its own cold language. Receipts, phone pings, fibers, and the stain patterns on discarded clothing. That language, pieced together by detectives and technicians, framed a narrative that no live stream of denials could erase. Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell were arrested amid a trail of small but damning breadcrumbs. A burner phone tied to a frantic social post, hotel clerks who remembered faces, maps abandoned in a hurry. Fraud charges were easy to prove first, giving investigators time to build the weightier case. But the real weight came from the alignment of physical evidence with a timeline. The hardware store purchases of tools, the bleach receipts, the phone records that placed the couple near where Sydney's last signal had faded. Each connection tightened the net. In court, the prosecution's job was to translate for a jury what the records already suggested. a calculated lure disguised as casual dating, a plan dressed in ordinary purchases, a tidy social media persona used to trap a trusting person. The image of Audrey, a Tinder alias, collapsed into the reality of a younger woman whose photograph and false name helped ensnare Sydney. The defense insisted on ambiguity, that stories shifted, that terror and manipulation complicated reduced responsibility. But the evidence is not rhetorical, it is cumulative. Testimony from former associates of Trail was crucial. These were women who had once lived under the thumb of his fantasies, who described coercion, punishment, and the strange rituals that marked his control. They testified under protection and spoke of a man who had built an ideology around domination, a man who demanded obedience and cultivated fear. Their accounts were not cinematic. They were granular and, in their specificity, devastating. Small acts of control, repeated and normalized, add up to a system that can push people into compliance or silence. Aubrey's behavior in the courtroom only amplified the prosecution's portrait. He alternated between grandiosity and collapse, shouting declarations, attempting self-harm, suffering medical episodes, heart attacks and a stroke that created moments of chaos in an already tense trial. Those episodes became part of the record, not because they excused anything, but because they revealed a man whose life had long been turbulent and dangerous to others. When jurors saw images of evidence and heard the coroner speak plainly about cause of death, the gap between narrative and reality narrowed in ways words alone could not bridge. Bailey's story complicated public perception. Her past was one of trauma and exploitation, an arc from scholarship athlete to addiction and abuse, then to a relationship that preyed on her vulnerabilities. Prosecutors argued she had been an active participant in the plot. The defense countered that she had been groomed and coerced. The jury's task was to measure complicity against coercion, to weigh the evidence and decide whether she helped plan or was compelled to assist. In the end, the court rendered judgments that reflected those distinctions. Aubrey's conviction carried the heaviest sentence, while Bailey received life without parole. Sentences do not restore what was lost. They mark society's condemnation and establish accountability, but they do not bring back phone calls or candlelit vigils. For Sydney's parents, the legal conclusions were a kind of closure, a naming of responsibility that allowed public acknowledgement of an irreparable absence. For the witnesses who testified, the courtroom was a rex, laming a voice. To speak the truth in public was an act of defiance against a man who tried to erase agency from those he controlled. Beyond the verdicts, the case rippled outward into conversations about online safety and the mechanics of predation. Dating apps are design spaces. They can connect and also conceal. Profiles can be curated masks, and that anonymity can be weaponized. Communities that had once treated a Tinder match as a trivial prelude to romance began to instruct the young and inexperienced to prioritize safety rituals, share locations with trusted friends, arrange first meetings in public, and verify identities beyond photographs. Schools, local groups, and families took the story as a painful lesson. But even amid policy shifts and preventive programs, there remained the personal residue of loss. Nimsy continuing to search an empty apartment, a father's plea to the cameras, a mother's daily rituals that no longer ended with a text. Sydney's tattoo, an optimistic phrase inked on an arm, became a mournful emblem. The words that once held hope turned into a marker of absence. Friends and family tried to keep her memory alive not as a cautionary headline, but as the whole of who she had been. Playful, generous, funny, someone who loved theater and puzzles and kittens. The trial's aftermath did not simplify into tidy moral lessons. It left a tangle of questions about culpability, the social forces that predate on vulnerability, and the limits of punishment. Yet it also produced small, persistent acts of remembrance, scholarships in Sydney's name, community talks about consent, and renewed efforts to help survivors of coercion find support. In the end, the legal system offered its version of justice. The community offered rituals of mourning and protection. And the life stolen remained in memory, More than a story of danger. A life full of ordinary luminous things that deserve to be remembered with tenderness rather than reduced to a single tragic evening.